Okay, so today's topic is the philosophy of social science and the philosophy of history. And this look, based upon what you've read, Rosenberg, Day, and Owens, provides us with a broad view about our orientation to social science and historical research, as we will discuss. So we begin with social science. Of course, the central concern of social science is to acquire knowledge of human behavior, as well as the nature of society and the nature of social interaction. And there are two core competing methodological approaches in social science. And these two approaches or orientations yield two different conceptions of the meaning and practice of social science. And in some sense, we need to make a choice about where we, as social science researchers, as educational researchers, where we situate ourselves, which orientation we might gravitate towards. So the first orientation is that, and the oldest in social science, an attempt to model social science on the basis of natural science, and thereby the scientific pursuit of explaining human behavior and the functioning of society through the search for causal laws, and also that would allow us to predict human behavior. So that's one broad orientation to social science. The second orientation is quite different, actually, and it is it conceives social science as inquiry into the meaning of human action. It forgoes an attempt to uncover causal laws and predictive power in the interest of understanding human action, understanding its meaning, and by understanding the meaning of human action, to understand, to render that action rather intelligible. So the second orientation, the interpretive orientation, is distinct from the empiricist, naturalist, and positivist approach to social knowledge. One pursues empirical causal laws with predictive power. The other pursues meaning and intelligibility of human action. So we can look more closely at empiricism, the empiricist approach. Empirical theory and knowledge is based upon, and this comes from the nature of science, is based upon contingent claims that are open to falsification and thus disconfirmation. So a scientific proposition is one that it can be subjected to testing in order to try to falsify it. And if the proposition or claim survives falsification, that establishes its validity. Not absolute validity, but validity on a contingent basis until further it remains open to the possibility of falsification in the light of new evidence, new facts, etc. Propositions that are not open to falsification cannot provide us with causal predictive knowledge. They're not scientific kinds of propositions. Like, for example, a religious proposition about the existence of God, for example, is not generally open to falsification, and therefore is a religious proposition rather than a scientific one. So empiricist social science seeks causal predictive knowledge of human action, and it seeks a causal theory of behavior thereby. It attempts to discover models, regularities, causes that enable the prediction of human behavior in its broad orientation. And it's, as Rosenberg suggests, it's based on a fundamental proposition or hypothesis L. And hypothesis L reads, if any agent X wants D, and X believes that A is a means to attain D under the circumstances, then X does A. This is a formula that links intention and reason, desires, beliefs to our behavior. That behavior is explainable, can be explained and predicted based upon our desires and beliefs, our reasons. Social science, given this assumption, social science becomes the search for causal models, generalizations, and laws that can predict human action. So it looks at intentional causes of action as the way to establish the relationship between beliefs, desires, and actions. And therefore, what is needed is a way to empirically measure what a person believes and or desires, like a thermometer measuring heat by its distinct effect on mercury. So beliefs, desires, and actions must have a contingent relationship in order to be open to empirical falsification and therefore to lead to the discovery of some causal law of behavior. So the idea here is that human behavior is predictable if we could understand the intentions of people's behavior. If we can really understand their beliefs and desires, then we can predict their behavior. That's the basic idea. And it's a common sense kind of psychology at its foundation. There is, however, a core problem with this formulation historically, as it has been critiqued. The hypothesis L is true by definition. It defines what it means actually to be a rational actor. Of course, beliefs, desires, and actions are logically connected. In fact, action is defined as behavior motivated by beliefs and desires. Beliefs and desires are not contingent, they're logically related to action. And if so, they are not causally related. In other words, the hypothesis is not falsifiable. It's a logical relation. It's not an empirical relation. It's true by definition that we are motivated by our beliefs and desires. A causal model of behavior does not seem possible thereby. It would seem impossible to predict human action with precision, with the precision sought by empirical social science. That doesn't mean that empirical social science is not valuable. We have to adjust our expectation. The best that empiricist social science has been able to produce is, as and we'll discuss this further, is statistical generalizations regarding patterns and tendencies of human action. That the achievement is very significant, but it's not prediction. So we are able to understand broad tendencies and probabilities of those tendencies, but the exact prediction of human behavior seems to be beyond our capability to know. Like the stock market, you can't predict the stock market precisely, but you can uncover generalizations of the behavior of the stock market. But it's as an example, or political behavior. You can't predict exactly what the outcome of an election will be, for example. You can guess based upon a generalized patterns, but it might not turn out that way, as we know from our experience. It would seem that candidate X should be elected, but candidate Y becomes elected because it's not fully predictable. In response to this problem, 3 additional attempts have been contemplated to change the focus or the unit of analysis of social science, empiricist social science, away from intentional action. And those 3 are behaviorism, rational choice theory, and the idea of social facts, the existence of social facts. So behaviorism the behaviorists argued that there are no need to consider intentionality, that hypothesis L was mentalistic and teleological in its perspective, and behaviorists recommended replacing that perspective with a mechanistic approach that allowed for prediction and causal explanation. And central to this was a distinction between mere reflex behavior and operant voluntary behavior. It replaced L with the law of effect. Reinforced behavior will be repeated with greater frequency, while punished behavior will be repeated with less frequency. So the behaviorists argue that we can forget about intentions, forget about what people believe or don't believe, what they want or don't want. We can understand human behavior through conditioning. And their basis of their research paradigm was the study of rat behavior, or the behavior of mice in mazes. However, it's clear even for using mice and rats as their subjects as conditioned behavior, the mice themselves were engaged in food searching behavior, and they were conditioned based upon their desire for food. So even in that very narrow point of view, the behaviorist can't escape intention, even amongst more simple mammals. So intention, and some kind of intention, is always there, it would seem. And so behaviorism failed in its attempt to escape intentional action. That's not to discount its discoveries about the influence of reinforcement on behavior. The second attempt response was rational choice theory, that rational choice theorists maintain that economic and political behavior can be causally explained and predicted by the rational choice of individuals. They attempted to discover the instrumental predictive power of rational choice. There seems, however, to be evidence that non-rational influence on choice are prominent in human behavior. So rational choice theory, given the non-rational influences on choice, cannot predict behavior. The third response, and perhaps the most interesting alternative, is the effort to establish social facts independent of individual action. And if social facts exist, then the empirical problems of causally explaining and predicting intentionality may be averted. We might not. Social phenomenon may be independent of individual intention, in other words, and individual action, in fact. And therefore, intentionality would be a misplaced unit of analysis. So one alternative is to change the unit of analysis to social facts rather than individual actions. And this was brought on by Emile Durkheim, the French sociologist, one of the founders of social science. And interestingly, he was interested in studying suicide rates in France in the late 19th century. And why do people commit suicide? Why do they take their own life? And what accounts for the shifting rates of suicide in a society? And his findings verified that change in suicide rates was not caused by individual psychological factors. That suicide rates are explained by differences in the degree of social integration. That is, the existence of particular social conditions. That when society becomes more integrated, socially integrated, when people are more connected to each other, suicide rates drop. When when social conditions give rise to disconnection between people, suicide rates increase. I think we saw this in recent years during the pandemic, which was a set of social facts that and suicide rates went up. There was a social fact of social disconnection, isolation, due to the social conditions of the pandemic. So Durkheim concluded, based upon his research, that empirical social facts exist independently of individual intention or action. However, the explanation based in social facts do not rise to the level of causality. It's based upon a statistical generalization, which is grounded in probability and correlation between variables. So social facts have significant explanatory power and value. However, they remain on the level of patterns and tendencies and probable outcomes rather than causal prediction. One example would be the statistical relation between family income and educational attainment as a social fact. It's not causal. There's a strong general connection or relationship between family income and educational attainment. It's not always true. Some individuals do very well, achieve at a very high level, who come from a family that it doesn't have a high income. But overall, the tendency is that family wealth and income are related to educational attainment, number of years of schooling, test performance, etc. So that's an interesting possibility, is that social science, empiricist social science, can be focused on social facts that escape the problems of intention, but still remain without causal prediction. So a conclusion we could draw is that empiricist social science research it seems that the best that can be achieved is statistical generalizations regarding social facts. It's not insignificant. The establishment of social facts and the capability to understand them in terms of generalizations is of significant value. This understanding of empiricist social science is consistent with what David Hume described as the problem of induction. That's never been solved. That you can't, based upon the pattern of experience, just because something has always occurred in a particular way, doesn't mean it will continue to occur. And you can't, in other words, you can't predict future events based upon what's past events, even though the past events have been very consistent in their pattern. In response to Hume, the best answer has been that we can't achieve causality and prediction, but we can understand broad patterns and broad generalizations. We can understand the probability of events occurring in certain ways based upon statistical generalizations. And perhaps that's the best that empiricist social science can achieve. In contrast, interpretive social science provides us with a very different perspective on the pursuit of social science knowledge, and the aim here is to make intelligible human action through interpretation. Intentions are explanatory because they constitute reasons for actions. And interpretists argue that the aim of social science should be to make action intelligible by interpreting the meaning of these reasons. Human action is explained by interpreting it, that is, by giving it meaning. And thus, interpretation, the attempt to interpret the meaning of human action and human experience and the intentions that underlie it, are at their core hermeneutic. Hermeneutics is and we'll look at this later in more detail, the nature of hermeneutics, later in the course. Hermeneutics is a method of textual interpretation originally, and it derives the meaning of a text from understanding the rules that constitute the text. So the fundamental task of interpretation is to discover the meaning of the rules of the text. And this was developed in terms of trying to interpret the meaning of various religious scriptures, like the Bible, among other scriptures. And it follows that interpretation of the meaning of human action is contingent upon understanding thereby the rules that give it meaning, the rules under which action falls. So hypothesis L, from this perspective, is a rule and not a causal law. So recognizing the recognition of the actor of the rules is the basis of the meaning of the action. Intelligibility and meaning is contingent upon the recognition of the rule. Rules explain because they render actions intelligible. From a social point of view, social rules, social norms, social rules combine to generate roles in social roles that in turn combine to generate institutions. So institutions, the university, schools as institutions, are really are a combination of social rules and norms, values. And those rules, and therefore institutions, are social constructions. They are generated by the choice of individuals and groups of individuals engaged in deliberative processes. So we deliberate and we choose our rules. The rules do not exist independently of people's intentions. Thus, they constitute reasons for action. So understanding that society is composed of rule-generated institutions, that society is composed of these institutions, is constructed, is one of the main aims of interpretive social science. I didn't say that well, but understanding a society as a social construction with a particular meaning is the main aim of this approach to social science. So we can summarize this overview of the two orientations to social science as that they suggest that social science inquiry, and that would include educational research, can establish social facts independently of individual psychology and thereby intentional actions on the one hand. And these social facts can be understood in terms of statistical generalizations that are not fully predictable but are based in probability. And perhaps more significantly, interpretive social science has the potential to provide us the understanding of the meaning of action through interpretation, and uncovers the socially constructed nature of social institutions. turning to history, there's a number of questions we could ask of history and the discipline of history. We could ask, what is the nature of historical reasoning? What counts as historical knowledge? What methods of inquiry can be used to uncover and explain the past? What constitutes historical evidence or historical facts? What's the nature of interpretation in history? We could ask the question, should the discipline of history aim at a mere description, or should it engage in some kind of critical interpretation of the past, some kind of interpretation? And this is parallel to the questions of social science. So history has to do with the relations with the past. And there are at least three conceptions of that relationship. One is that we want to preserve the past, and that history is about the preservation of the past. A second conception is that history is dialogical, that we do history, the historian engages in historical inquiry to engage in a dialogue with the past, and to the historical understanding is iterative in its development. And a third conception of the relation with the past is practical, that we want to know the past and understand the past in order to understand the present. That the present is constructed out of the past. Historical evidence is primarily one of the chief sources and primary sources of evidence is, of course, archival evidence, usually in written form, but it can also be in oral form. And oral history is a possible source of evidence, of historical evidence. Testimony, as we'll see, as a source of evidence. So history tends to be archival in many different forms. And it engages in the inquiry into two kinds of sources. The primary sources are accounts of an event written by someone who experienced or witnessed the event. So a direct primary accounting of some historical event. This person was in the room where it happened and wrote it down, wrote notes. And so we have perhaps a primary direct account of a particular event. Secondary sources, also valuable, are one step removed from primary sources, and they are ones that interpret, assign value, and conjecture about, and draw conclusions about the event. So more second-hand accounts. And in terms of evidence, sources, both primary and secondary, should be criticized and compared against each other. Primary sources are the most valuable in understanding the past. First-hand accounts of things. What is, especially ones that have been recorded in some fashion close to the event, because memory is, our memory can slip away, and memory can become distorted. If we might do an oral history asking someone about an event that occurred 40 years ago, and that their memory might not be completely reliable. So, historical methodology. One prominent approach to history is as referred to as historicism, is that history is an attempt to do historical research is writing history as it really happened, an attempt, kind of a photographic attempt to recapture what happened precisely. And this view of history attempts to be responsible to the historical sources and not to embellish on them or to engage in any kind of interpretation of them. And it privileges concrete historical phenomenon. It's often presented as a scissors and paste kind of history, which has its problems. Collections of memories, common sense theory. Historicism relies heavily on testimony, and in particular the testimony of authorities, of authoritative figures, historical figures. And there's a tendency to take the truth of those testimonies at face value. An alternative is critical history, which argues that not all testimony and memory should be taken at its face value. Testimonies are important, memory is important, but it needs to be scrutinized rather than taken at its face value. And critical history wants to look at sources rather than authorities. Just because President X said this, as the or someone in authority had this account, that doesn't make it true, the true account. That person might have been motivated to color the history, especially the history that they were involved in, kind of sanitizing the history. So we can't find, from this perspective, we can't find an accurate historical account in ready-made testimony of past. We need to compare as many written documents as are available in order to kind of triangulate those documents to interpret them. There might be false testimony, for example, of authorities. There may be omissions in the testimony of authorities, etc. So a variety of sources will yield a better history, is the idea, a more accurate one. This leads us to a conception of historical reasoning. Historical reasoning prioritizes primary sources, but applies a critical approach to those sources, looking at its claims critically and the authenticity of sources. We have to critically examine whether the source, and in particular the primary source, is authentic. Is it a true accounting, or was it made up in some sense? And that requires that we look at internal features of the source, its aim, its ideological background, and consider the audience through which it was intended to be received. We also look at the source criticism. We have to examine why the source has survived in its particular form. What are the reasons? And very importantly, the use of multiple sources, providing a wide range of evidence, and not reliance on a single source for the past. Attempting to view a historical event from multiple perspectives, embodied in multiple sources. So historical reasoning is about the justification of the validity of a historical claim by reference to evidence. So evidence is of great importance here, as it is in social science. The Bayesianism, or the Bayesian approach to evidence and historical reasoning from evidence suggests we need to look at a probabilistic relationship between the hypothesis and evidence. And that implies that a belief is never conclusively proven by the evidence, that all conclusions are contingent, because we don't have the full array of evidence. New sources may be revealed, new interpretations of those sources may be revealed, and that we should compare probabilities for the best explanation. What is the most probable relationship between the hypothesis and the evidence? That's one approach to historical reasoning, is to look at the probability of a relationship. What is the likelihood that this relationship is valid? A second approach is to look for the best explanation of the historical event. What explains, looking for the best explanation of the evidence, and to acknowledge that new evidence can alter the explanation. So historical reasoning, another conception of historical reasoning, is that reasoning is an attempt to find the best explanation of the evidence. So the best explanation should prevail. Regarding interpretation is making sense of, as we've discussed earlier. We have to ask when we interpret something, we have to ask what its presuppositions are, whether it's determined or undetermined by the evidence. And we can use empathy, but as a tool, but it's not. We should recognize that it's not a presupposition of historical knowledge. It can be useful, but it's not a feature of historical knowledge that we enter into the lived experience of someone. In terms of the historical inquiry, Collingwood argued that history was, he had a conception of history as reenactment, that the historian reenacts past thoughts expressed in language and implicit in the actions of the actors of the historical event. And this is a way of understanding the past as living in the present. So from this perspective, to interpret a historical event is to redescribe it. and it's not to identify what caused it. So from Collingwood's perspective, history is about reenactment and a redescription of the event. So we're attempting to understand the past as living in the present. Another conception is that the past, that we look in historical research, we're looking at whether the past is rational, the rationality of the past. That the preferred historical interpretation is one that best shows that the past action was rational. And thereby it attends to the perspective of the actor. And rational here means, in general, that the actor engaged in instrumental reasoning. That is, they conceived what ends they wanted to achieve, and they selected the means to that achievement. So rationality could mean here instrumentalism. It could also mean, if we are seeking the best explanation of the past as the most rational explanation, we could ask what the interpreter of that event or action would do in the same situation. So the historian would attempt to place themselves as much as possible in the circumstances of the actor that they're examining and ask themselves, what would they do in the same situation? And that is a way of getting at the rationality of the past as well. Finally, history and the interpretation and meaning occur in a social context. And therefore, social and historical interpretation is more about providing appropriate social context than reenactment. This is another view of the work of the historian. So from this point of view, we're not trying to redescribe or reenact the past. We're not trying to determine whether the past action was rational. Now, from this perspective, we're trying to understand the social context within which the event occurred, the choices were made, and trying to understand the context within those that would illuminate the meaning of those choices and explain those choices by reference to their social context. So these are all different conceptions of the work and the methodology of historical inquiry. Finally, we have the interesting approach that Hannah Arendt took. Hannah Arendt was a philosopher at her core, but she, in particular, a political philosopher. But she argued that political thought has to be grounded in historical knowledge, that you can't really have authentic political theorizing without situating it within history. And her historical method was grounded in the lived incidents or the lived experience of persons as the guidepost for thinking about politics and about society. And her method was to use the lives of real people, the lived experience of real people, to illuminate historical moments. She thought you could best understand a particular historical moment by examining the lived experience of those who lived in that moment. And she did not look to processes as the social processes, rejecting empiricist social science and historical accounts. She thought that was a mistake to try to understand historical events in the context of sweeping evolutionary developments in history, as Karl Marx, for example, did, that all history could be understood if it was placed in a developmental sequence from feudalism to capitalism to socialism to communism. She rejected that idea, or the idea that rationality has evolved in human beings from reaching its pinnacle in modern Europe. She rejects that as well, in favor of examining events themselves as the proper subject of historical writing. And in one of her famous works, The Origins of Totalitarianism, she examined racism, anti-Semitism, and imperialism as elements, as features, as social features that came together in a particular moment, historical moment, that generated the phenomenon of totalitarianism. So events are crystallized around certain events that are not really predictable. They're there in the social fabric at the time, and they come together. And it's understanding the crystallization of these elements that history should be devoted to, in her view. And this suggests that history is about characterizing or understanding the character of a particular time, historical moment. How did we come? What were the features that came together for this in this moment? Is the idea. She doesn't deny the existence of structures or processes. Rather, she argued that events were not the mere manifestation of these forces. That events possess an intelligibility and significance on their own. So we can understand an event on its own rather than placing it in some kind of developmental sequence or some causal process orientation or explanation. So this is a kind of phenomenological analysis centered on meaningfulness, the meaningfulness of the lived experience of events. And it prioritizes intersubjective and the experiential character of being in the world. And the task is to understand the phenomenon and the events in their particularity. So it's very much an interpretive approach to social science and history. To identify the new. So we want to engage in historical research that forsakes trends, but tries to understand unique events and to detect what is new in those events, what is unique in those events that are emerging. So these are broad orientations to social science and to history that are maybe of value in orienting ourselves as educational theorists and educational researchers, where we might place ourselves in this array of conceptions of inquiry.